This right here is North Korea. North Korea is dangerous. Very, very dangerous.
Praise all round in North Korea after its latest test of an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Kim Jong-un showing off North Korea's most powerful nuclear missiles to top Chinese and Russian officials.
Pyongyang's most provocative launch in months.
North Korea has published photos in its state newspaper of what it says are small nuclear warheads that can be fitted onto short-range missiles.
Quickly condemned by Japan as an unacceptable threat to regional stability.
To put it candidly, North Korea is an outlier, an unpredictable one at that. Run by the Kim dynasty, with the current dictator Kim Jong-un in power, the Korean nation has shaped itself to be one of, if not the most mysterious nation on the planet. North Korea is completely closed off to the world, with a lot of what we know about it coming from spy missions and the few survivors who have managed to escape the country. The nation is so closed off that there is a shoot-to-kill order for anyone who arrives at its Chinese border. The citizens themselves, on the other hand, know next to nothing about the outside world, with Kim Jong-un keeping a strong grip on what his citizens know. Just owning foreign media content is a punishable crime with up to 15 years in jail. Censorship and propaganda in the country are so bad that it basically makes China seem like the land of the free and the home of the brave. However, this house of fear and military libertinism is crumbling and collapsing on itself. With hunger and economic ruin pounding on the nation's doors, could this be the end of North Korea as we know it? In this video, we will dive into the history of North Korea, how it came to be feared, the Kim dynasty, how it has survived so long, and if indeed there is a future for the nation. Speaking of futures, please help ensure the future of the channel by liking and commenting on this video. That simple action says to the you-know-who algorithm that you find our content interesting, and that in turn helps the channel grow. With that out of the way, let's get back to the basics. North Korea has a long and troubled history. The nation has a long history, albeit a largely sad one, and you can see how its past has affected its present on a very deep level. So, in order to understand what's currently going on, let's take a trip to the past and see how the country came to be. Unlike other countries, like the 247-year-old United States, North Korea is relatively young. In fact, the history of North Korea began with the end of World War II in 1945. That's not too long ago. Prior to that time, the whole of Korea had been under Japanese rule. This had been so since 1910, and Japan had for an entire generation suppressed Korean culture and heritage and made the land theirs. However, with the defeat of the Japanese in 1945 came the freedom of Korea. The territory was taken from Japan as proceeds of war, leading to the division of Korea at the 38th parallel by the United States, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south. The Soviet Union, the power that was given the North to administer, then refused to follow the UN mandate for democratic elections nationwide. This led to the United States declaring the democratically elected government of South Korea as the sole legitimate government of the Korean Peninsula because it was, well, democratic. This decision by the United Nations created massive tensions with the Korean Peninsula. It all ultimately led to the communist dictatorship in the North rejecting the United Nations proclamation and claiming the sole right to rule Korea. Kim Il-sung, the then North Korea's supreme leader, made this proclamation. Keep this family tree fresh in your mind. It'll help you understand the Kim dynasty as we go along. Because he had massive support from the Soviet Union, he was somewhat unleashed to do as he pleased. Kim Il-sung then declared that the land will be called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or as we will be calling it throughout the video, DPRK. This was on September 9, 1948. The communist government proceeded to claim sole legitimacy to rule the entire Korean peninsula, with Seoul as its capital. As you can imagine, this wasn't taken well or lying down. There was one result that was to come out of this war. It wasn't long before this war came about. Months later, on the 25th of June 1950, around 75,000 soldiers from the northern Korean peninsula crossed over the 38th parallel, the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the north and the pro-Western Republic of Korea to the south. The war had begun. History will remember this moment as the first aggressive military action of the Cold War between the sides backed by the Soviet Union and the United States. The moment the northern soldiers invaded the South, America took action. Barely a month after the invasion had started, American boots were on the ground. You see, in Washington's eyes, this was much more than a US-backed South versus a Russian-backed North. For the US, it was against the forces of international communism itself. President Harry Truman at the time said, "If we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another." That's just how passionate the United States felt about this endeavor. That passion, however, was facing the rock-hard wall of North Korea's will. This made the war incredibly hard for the allied forces of America, South Korea, and their friends. Caught somewhat off guard, the Southern forces were frightened, confused, and seemed inclined to flee the battlefield at any provocation. To put it simply, they were not battle-hardened. As if that wasn't enough, that period saw one of the hottest and driest summers on record, and desperately thirsty American soldiers were often forced to drink water from rice paddies that had been fertilized with human waste. You can imagine the result that came from this. Everything around the camps became a cesspool of disease and infection. On the other hand, the North Korean army was well-disciplined, well-trained, and well-equipped. They had not come into the war unprepared, and their initial assaults reflected that. The first several months of the war were characterized by armies advancing and retreating up and down the Korean peninsula. The initial North Korean attack drove United Nations command forces to a narrow perimeter around the port of Pusan in the southern tip of the peninsula. After the front stabilized at the Pusan perimeter, General MacArthur, the commander in charge of the Allied forces, surprised the North Koreans in September 1950 with an amphibious landing at Incheon via North Korean lines, forcing the North Koreans to retreat behind the 38th parallel. Though the Incheon landing and the assault that followed was a success, it also brought about unwanted results. As American troops crossed the boundary at the 38th parallel and headed north towards the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Communist China, the Chinese started to worry about protecting themselves from what they called armed aggression against Chinese territory. The then Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, sent troops to North Korea and warned the United States to keep away from the Yalu boundary unless it wanted a full-scale war. China already supported North Korea's communist agenda, but to risk direct war with China was something that the United Nations did not want. The US, however, did not have any problem with that. As we said before, the spread of communism was viewed as a direct threat to the existence of America. In October, the United Nations, urged by the United States government, approved the movement of UN forces across the 38th parallel into North Korea in an effort to unify the country under a non-communist government. In spite of warnings issued by the Chinese government, the United Nations forces moved towards the Yalu River, marking the North Korean border with Manchuria. Discounting the significance of initial Chinese attacks in late October, MacArthur ordered the United Nations command to launch an offensive, taking the forces to the Yalu. That was the last straw for the Chinese, who then came together in full coordination in late November to attack. The Chinese offensive together with the North Korean army was so strong that it pushed the might of the United Nations command south of the 38th parallel in a fell swoop. That invading force went on to take the South Korean capital of Seoul as well. That had to be quite the push if you ask us. However, it wasn't long before this pushed the ground to a halt. By early 1951, the Chinese offensive had lost its momentum, and the UNC, bolstered by the energized 8th U.S. Army, led by General Matthew B. Ridgway, retook Seoul from the Communists and advanced back to the 38th parallel. They were back in their own territory. From July 1951 until the end of the hostilities, the battle lines remained relatively stable, and the conflict ground to what effectively is a stalemate. With millions of lives having been lost and very little change having taken place on the ground, the Truman administration abandoned its original plans. Coming into the war, the hope had been to reunite North and South Korea and rid themselves of communism in the Korean peninsula. But now the US just wanted to avoid the possible escalation of the conflict into a Third World War involving China and the Soviet Union. US President Eisenhower, who took charge after Truman's term ended, said something that could be regarded as the culmination of American feelings at the time. He said, "We could not stand forever on a static front and continue to accept casualties without any visible results. Small attacks on small hills would not end this war." President Eisenhower soon sought to end the violence that had now encapsulated the peninsula. Using both the rod and the carrot, President Eisenhower finally achieved his goal of bringing an armistice on July 27, 1953. America was trying hard to fashion lasting peace in order to avoid a wider war with Russia and China, or even, as some word, World War III. However, after America's withdrawal, despite having waged a vicious war on the fronts, left the Korean peninsula just as divided as it had been since the close of World War II at the 38th parallel. There wasn't much real change, just piled up bodies of dead soldiers and civilians who, as painful as it sounds, had their deaths come with no quantifiable change in the geopolitical sense. All in all, by the time the armistice turned into the ending of the war, over 5 million soldiers and civilians had lost their lives in what many in the US refer to as the Forgotten War. This was because of the lack of attention it received compared to more well-known conflicts like World War I and II and the Vietnam War. The Korean Peninsula remains divided today along similar borders, with the two sides agreeing on a border formed by the Korean Demilitarized Zone. Here's an interesting fact to note about North and South Korea. Because the two nations never signed an official peace treaty, the two Koreas technically have been at war since 1950. Imagine that. It's a frozen war. We wanted to talk about why we decided to sponsor our own videos. As regular viewers of the channel know, we don't get sponsors a lot because our content is controversial. That's why we decided to launch YouTube Basics Academy. But let us first tell you, being a YouTuber isn't for everyone. So before you decide to start a channel, you must first decide whether this is something you want to do. But if you are someone who has thought about having your own channel, but aren't quite sure if YouTube is for you or not, then we have a guide for you. This is exactly why we created a free 5-day email course that gives you a peek into what it's like being a YouTuber. That way, you can make an informed decision of whether that's something you want to do. You can sign up for this free 5-day course by clicking the link in the description. Best of all, if you sign up now, you can get a free guide on the best YouTube niches for beginners. So click the link below or scan the QR code on your screen to sign up. After the war, things got very, for lack of a better word, interesting in North Korea. Kim Il-sung tightened control of North Korean politics with the support of the armed forces whom he, in classical dictator style, made sure they received pay and benefits. An official, Park Hon-yong, who had been the National Party's vice chairman and foreign minister of DPRK, was blamed for the failure of the southern population to support North Korea during the war and suffered execution after a show trial in 1955. In fact, most of the South Korean leftists who defected to the North in 1945 to 1953 also received charges of espionage or other crimes against the state, leading to their execution, imprisonment, or exile to remote agricultural and mining villages. This marked the beginning of an aggressive weeding by Kim Il-sung as he purged his rivals. This cleared the way for Kim to have what was simply absolute power in the nation. Perhaps you can say this was the key to the creation of a godlike status for the Kims in North Korea, using the help of the secret police. With internal political matters handled, Kim started the attempt to rebuild the nation. In this pursuit, he announced the 1954 to 1956 three-year plan. Its goals were simple, on paper at least. The three-year plan was supposed to repair the massive damage caused by the war and bring industrial production back to pre-war dismal levels. To add to this, Kim followed that with a 5-year plan of 1957 to 1961 and the 7-year plan of 1961 to 1967. This is the part where we'd like to say that the plans were a raging success, and now North Korea was swimming in money like Daffy Duck, but unfortunately no. All these plans failed dismally to bring growth in industrial protection and substantial development of state infrastructure. By the 1960s, North Korea's state-controlled organs proclaimed that North Korea had become the second most industrialized nation in East Asia, trailing only Japan. This, of course, was just pure propaganda. The reality of the situation was that North Korea was at death's door. Kim's war adventures and total state control of the economy had put North Korea in an absolutely horrible position. Kim Il-sung made several blunders that had led the economy to that point, a point of utter brokenness. In 1954, the dictatorship commanded a partial collectivization, with peasants being urged, often forced, into agricultural cooperatives. By 1958, collectives conducted virtually all farming, and the cooperatives increasingly merged into larger productive units. The challenge was that because ethos wasn't organic and instead was forced, the production wasn't what Kim hoped for. Also, like all the post-war communist states, North Korea undertook massive state investment in heavy industry, state infrastructure, and military buildup, neglecting the production of consumer goods. By paying the collectivized peasants low state-controlled prices for their products and using the surplus thus extracted to pay for industrial development, the state carried out a series of 3-year plans, bringing the industry's share of the economy from 47% in 1946 to 70% in 1959, despite the devastation of the Korean War. Huge increases in expenditures for electricity production, steel production, and machine building resulted. The government focused on producing tractors and other agricultural machinery in large numbers, with little increase in agricultural production. By 1958, North Korea's economy still depended largely on aid from the Soviet Union and China, its standard of living lagging dramatically behind South Korea. As a result of those dictatorial changes, the population suffered malnutrition and food shortages, while the state-controlled press painted a rosy picture. Anyone contradicting the state line that North Korean agriculture surpassed South Korea's and that the North Korean standard of living surpassed South Koreans dramatically received a nighttime visit from Kim Il-sung's secret police force often never heard from again. Standards of living, suffocated by the collectivization of farms, rapidly decreased in North Korea in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Only Kim's tight dictatorial control of the police, army, and media kept the North Korean farmer from rebelling in a classic peasant revolt. To make it worse, consumer goods, always in chronic shortage from the state-controlled mandate for production, rather than consumer-driven production as in the South, led to serious discontent. North Korea's economy had followed the Soviet Union's pattern. Instead of letting the marketplace determine what factories produced, the state mandated production quotas without consulting the real needs of consumers. As a result, goods that consumers did not want languished on shelves, while goods in high demand had long waiting lists. This is what led to severe shortages of the essentials. If we're being frank, it was only massive aid by Russia and China for ideological reasons to advance world communism that kept North Korea from collapsing. All the while, Kim used his police force to increase his image as a god and to demand worship by the people of North Korea. It was either that, or you defaulted to the punishment, which was, as you know by now, imprisonment and death. To the outside world, he went out of his way to portray the image of a prosperous nation, much like North Korea still does to this day. We're pretty sure you're asking yourselves where the international community was at this time. Well, visitors to North Korea received state-appointed guides. That means that they strictly traveled arranged routes, saw prepared city streets, and could never set out on their own. Any North Korean citizen who spoke with an international visitor without permission suffered imprisonment or death. Yes, how things were in North Korea. You know how you order your tea black or white? That's how easily imprisonment and death were easily offered up. That's a joke, but in all seriousness, it was easy to lose your life for a violation of crimes. In fact, according to current reports, it still is. The North Korean press presented North Korea as an alternative to the capitalist model of development sponsored by the United States. The state-controlled press announced that by the late 1960s, North Korea provided all its people with medical care, universal education, adequate caloric intake, and livable housing. This was all, well, we're a PG channel, so we'll just say that it was a lie. In fact, North Korea had the highest spending on military forces per capita in relation to GDP, while the population lived in poverty. Actually, it was more like wallowing in poverty, something you'll see being a trend as we go on. Despite this, Kim Il-sung continued to push the country in a direction that he saw fit. He promoted juche, meaning self-reliance, a slogan he began to develop in the late 1950s, ultimately proclaiming it as the nation's official ideology. Juche aimed to make North Korea self-sufficient. Ironically, the North Korean elite, the new class, had an insatiable appetite for quality and luxury products from Japan and the West, while the people of North Korea suffered without adequate food or housing. The dictatorship of the proletariat approved that practice, as the communist ruling government served as a transition to the workers' paradise. Although the state-controlled press worked hard to secure the truth of the common person's life in North Korea, the word of their real living circumstances came to South Korea, the West, and Japan through defectors. We will talk more about these defectors later in the video. The philosophy of juche served to support Kim Il-sung's communist dictatorship, but did nothing to improve the lives of common North Koreans. Kim used juche to urge the North Korean people to resist foreign invasion by launching a series of mass campaigns designed to strengthen the country economically, militarily, and culturally. One of Kim Il-sung's biggest challenges as a supreme leader came about as a result of the Sino-Soviet. This was when Russia and China parted ways due to differing interests, thereby placing North Korea's communist dictatorship in jeopardy from 1960. Relations between North Korea and the Soviet Union worsened when the Soviets concluded that Kim Il-sung supported the Chinese side. This was not entirely true. In actuality, Kim had hoped to capitalize on the tensions between the nations to grow in influence. However, once out of the Soviet Union graces, North Korea suffered. All the aid and credit it had enjoyed from the Soviet Union was now a big hole that China did not have the capacity to fill. What this spelled was doom for North Korea. As a result of this, Kim's enthusiasm for Mao Zedong's policies declined, despite his rhetorical denunciations of revisionism. While he supported Chinese campaigns such as the Great Leap Forward, he saw Maoist initiatives such as the 100 Flowers campaign and the Cultural Revolution as destabilizing and dangerous. In that way, Kim Il-sung showed his determination to mark an independent path for North Korea when possible. So, compiling all these factors, what do we have now in the story of the fall of North Korea? Well, Due to the inherent contradictions in Juche, the massive expenditures on the military without Chinese and Russian aid, the failure of the collectivization program, and the rejection of free enterprise, North Korea suffered declining economic fortunes, as have all communist dictatorships. North Korea's lack of foreign reserves and the prohibition many Western nations had placed on trade and investment in North Korea spiraled the country into economic depression. Put simply, North Korea had way too many problems and too few friends. During that time, Kim strengthened his grip on the country, looking for every opportunity to overthrow the South Korean government. It's funny what power can do to a man, even in times of dire struggle. The goal was still to rule more land. With such priorities misplaced, you can obviously guess what came next. More problems. By the 1970s, North Korea's economic condition had become dire. People think that rock bottom is the worst till you discover even lower rocks. Even the tight control by the state media had a hard time presenting a rosy picture of North Korean life, the official line becoming one of slight economic reverse. To make matters worse, the Soviet Union's cutoff of subsidized oil dealt a staggering blow to North Korea. At the same time, the price of oil on the international markets had reached an all-time high, combined with North Korea's depleted reserves of foreign currencies, especially US dollars, to create emergency conditions. Oh yes, we did mention that North Korea had a large deficit of friends, right? This made the sanctions and economic restrictions on it that much harder to bear. So, backed into a wall, what was North Korea to do? Well, turn to crime, of course. We're just kidding, but they did turn to shady work. To raise funds, the North Korean regime began to turn to weapon sales, drug sales, and counterfeiting United States dollars as a way of dealing with a shortage of US dollars. Kim needed money, and most of it went to funding the army, his army. Even in times of poverty, Kim continued to maintain one of the largest standing armies in the world. Most people can't fathom the idea of a population letting a leader get away with this. But well, in Korea, things went differently. Kim Il-sung advanced the idea through his communist-controlled press that he needed to build up his military to establish independence from Chinese and Russian aid. In reality, China and Russia increasingly cut North Korea off from military and economic aid, and moving into the 1980s and 1990s, the two governments increasingly found Kim to be an embarrassment. He made several diplomatic blunders, including an attempt to assassinate Park Chung-hee, an attempt to build invasion tunnels under the DMZ, and his provocation of war with the United States and South Korea through incidents like the Pueblo seizure, which left both China and Russia unenthusiastic. Stalin's legacy had been denigrated in Russia, and Kim ruled in the Stalinist fashion. The attempt to find finances to increase the wealth of his nation led Kim toward mining enterprises. This was done using forced labor in the mines and borrowed capital to purchase equipment. Even if the international community had decided to buy Kim's minerals, his plan fell apart with the collapse of the price of minerals. That totally threw what was already a reckless plan into the blender. Of course, those who kept suffering the most were the people who already suffered famine and a lack of even basic necessities. For people in Kim's military, or the new class of North Korean leadership, these problems were non-existent. Because of this, the propaganda of Kim's workers' paradise in North Korea kept being perpetuated. It was clear, however, that Kim's empire was hurting badly. For one, his centrally planned economy emphasized heavy industry and required capital that the North Korean communist dictatorship lacked. This led to not a change in strategy, but the continuation of a failed approach as Kim kept pushing Juche to the masses. Despite all this, it was now painfully clear that North Korea was far behind the rest of the world. What then sealed it for them was the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. With one of North Korea's major allies out of the picture, the nation was politically, economically, and militarily isolated. All that the nation was left with was China as its only major remaining ally. Maybe the shock of just how far the nation was falling, or it was a combination of other factors, but a few years later in 1994, Kim Il-sung died of a sudden heart attack and was succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il. Jong-il's reign did not start great either. In what was essentially his first year in power, widespread flooding destroyed crops and infrastructure, prompting a 3-year famine when the state-run economy failed to produce enough food. In this period, hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation, while scores of survivors, particularly children, suffered severe malnutrition. Realizing that the government was not there to help in any way, millions of North Koreans made or smuggled whatever they could sell or barter to survive. This underground economy became the only means that people could survive, but of course, the government ended up putting a stop to that. But the problems persisted, and much like in North Korea's typical fashion, Kim Jong-il's government announced a new policy called Jong-un, or military first. It was similar to what had existed in his father's reign, but more emphasized. His policies made the Korean People's Army the state's most powerful political and economic force in the nation, and the largest recipient of resources. It was under this new system that North Korea used its nuclear reactors to begin developing a nuclear weapons program. If it didn't have much going for it, it was definitely going to have a strong army. That seemed to be a theme it had carried forward for years. In July 2002, Kim announced some limited reforms. The government devalued the currency and allowed food prices to rise in the hope of stimulating agricultural production. Kim announced that food rationing systems as well as subsidized housing would be phased out. He introduced a family unit farming system on a trial basis for the first time since collectivization in 1954. The government also set up a special administrative zone in Sinuiju, a town near the border with China. The General Committee granted the local authority near autonomy, especially in its economic affairs. Kim attempted to emulate the success of such free trade zones in China, but attracted little outside interest. Despite some optimistic talk in the foreign press, the impetus of those reforms had not been followed with, for example, a large-scale decollectivization such as occurred in China under Deng Xiaoping. Attention was instead focused on the nuclear program, where North Korea followed through on threats and the like. By 2003, it withdrew from the 1995 Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. 3 years later, North Korea claimed to have successfully tested its first nuclear weapon, prompting the UN Security Council to impose a broad array of trade and travel sanctions. Despite US and international efforts to halt its nuclear ambitions, North Korea continued to develop its arsenal and conducted several tests to refine what it had. At this point, North Korea had adopted an attitude of realizing that they were the black sheep, and as such, they would do what they wanted. On the 19th of December 2011, the North Korean state television news reported the passing of one of the nation's leaders, Kim Jong-il. His son, Kim Jong-un, still in his mid-20s, took over as North Korea's third supreme leader. He was portrayed as a modern version of his grandfather, hence giving him a strong impression. At the start of his regime, Jong-un undertook to demote and, in particular instances, execute regime officials as a way to further secure his power base. It is estimated by a South Korean spy agency that Kim may have purged some 300 people after taking power. In 2014, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry accused the government of crimes against humanity. To make it worse, his regime cracked down on border crossings and further limited access to foreign media and the internet. Just take a look at this graph of defector numbers. After Jong-un was in power, there was a substantial decrease in those numbers due to his policies. There had been hopes that Jong-un would take steps to mend his nation's frayed relations with the West, but to put it mildly, he did not. If anything, he expedited the policies of his predecessors by using power to threaten other nations, most notably South Korea and the US, and accelerated the development and testing of nuclear weapons in the nation. In 2017, North Korea tested the Hwasong-15, an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of striking anywhere in the United States of America. Estimates of North Korea's nuclear arsenal indicate it could have over 60 bombs, probably including hydrogen bombs. In addition, it is believed to possess chemical and biological weapons. In fact, you can see from this graph that most of the nuclear tests done in North Korea's history have been under Kim Jong. Some leeway, however, was thought to have been made during the Trump administration when Kim met American President Donald Trump at a summit in Singapore and signed a declaration, again affirming a commitment to peace and denuclearization.
Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un are speaking ahead of their short one-to-one meeting.
He was observing Trump very carefully. It was very clear in the meeting that Kim was very much in control.
Buildup was dramatic. President Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un walked toward each other from opposite sides of the joint security area in the DMZ.
This was a special moment. This is, I think, really, as President Moon said, this is a historic moment, the fact that we're meeting.
This was the first of several meetings, with many of them breaking down without any resolutions agreed upon. But moving to the present day, with Jong-un still in power, how is North Korea faring? Well, the situation in the country is as bleak as it's ever been. This is because, on one hand, North Korea's human violations have reached peak levels, and on the other hand, the country's economy is simply in the gutter. Let's start with human rights violations. Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has consistently spoken out aggressively about it this year. Volker Turk told the first open meeting of the UN Security Council since 2017 on North Korean human rights that in the past, its people have endured periods of severe economic difficulty and repression. But currently, they appear to be suffering both. More like a double trouble type of scenario. He said, "According to our information, people are becoming increasingly desperate as informal markets and other coping mechanisms are dismantled, while their fear of state surveillance, arrest, interrogation, and detention has increased." A big part of these violations also come into play because the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, closed the borders of his Northeast Asian nation to contain COVID-19, or at least that was the official cause. Unofficially, he used the incident to increase harsh measures on border patrols and to increase controls on his citizens. This fact has been supported by the realization that despite the worst of the pandemic being over, the North Korean government's restrictions have grown even more extensive. In fact, guards at the borders are authorized to shoot any unauthorized person approaching the border, and all foreigners, including UN staff, are still barred from the country. That is a bit excessive for covered fears, don't you think? That's not all. Another example of how there is a repression of human rights is that anyone found viewing reactionary ideology and culture, something which just means information from abroad, especially from South Korea, can pay for it by facing between 5 to 15 years in prison. For those who participate in the distribution of such material, well, those can face life imprisonment or even the death penalty. All this makes it hard to live freely or to fully express creativity in any way whatsoever. Thinking of how people live their day-to-day lives is quite depressing, to be honest. Elizabeth Salman, the UN Special Investigator on Human Rights in North Korea, echoed Turk's thoughts, reiterating the North Koreans are dying due to hunger, malnutrition, diseases, and lack of access to healthcare. But human rights violations are not all that is plaguing the nation. To put it simply, the nation has horrible economic issues, and according to Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the government has largely shut down markets and other private means of generating income and increasingly criminalized such activity. His exact words were, "This sharply constrains people's ability to provide for themselves and their families," he said. Given the limits of state-run economic institutions, many people appear to be facing extreme hunger, as well as acute shortages of medication. It really is no mystery as to why this is so. Most of the resources that the nation pulls are immediately sent into militarizing the nation even more. Turk says of the situation, for example, the widespread use of forced labor, including labor in political prison camps, forced use of school children to collect harvests, the requirements for families to undertake labor and provide a quota of goods to the government, and confiscation of wages from overseas workers, all support the military apparatus of the state and its ability to build weapons. One could think that maybe, because since no peace treaty was officially signed at the end of the Korean War in 1950-53, this frozen conflict, so to say, is then being used to justify the continued militarization of the nation, albeit at the expense of the citizens. And we know we've mentioned this a few times in the video, but it bears repetition for every era of every Kim that leads North Korea. People are suffering, and now that hunger is making them desperate. On February 10th this year, a starving man in his 70s took a stand outside the Communist Party office in Hisan, a city in the northern part of North Korea. As party members arrived for work, he called out, "I'll die of starvation if things continue like this. Please give me food." Other famished people quickly joined him. When security guards tried to dispel the crowd, a skirmish ensued. In a country where causing a disturbance can get you sent to prison or executed, you know people have to be desperate to reach these levels of sad complaints. Perhaps such cases, more than anything else, reveal just how bad the food and economic situation in the closed-off nation has become. The UN reckons that between 2019 and 2021, 42% of North Koreans were malnourished. There is very little food in the nation as a result of poor weather conditions and a shortage of fertilizer, in part due to the country's self-imposed 3-year quarantine. That all made it all but certain that there was an especially poor harvest in 2022. Total food production was only 4.5 million tons, down by 3.8% compared with the year before, according to South Korea's Rural Development Agency. That is more than 1.2 million tons, less than the UN's World Food Program estimated in 2019 was needed to feed the country. This isn't all that new. If you have been listening, we're sure you know by now that North Korea's agricultural system has long failed to produce enough food for North Korea's 26 million people. A famine in the 1990s cost between 200,000 to 3 million, showing that if not addressed, there is potential for things to deteriorate further to such levels. The prices of rice and maize, which make up 98% of the country's cereal production, hint at the seriousness of the situation. Both reached 5-year highs this year, according to Daily NK, a Seoul-based outlet with contacts inside North Korea. The cost of maize is rising fastest, suggesting that North Koreans are being forced to opt for that less calorific crop. To try and help everyday citizens, the World Food Program, an international organization within the United Nations that provides food assistance worldwide, has tripled its budget for North Korea. However, this has been of little consequence because the UN's agency staff are barred from entering the country, and there is currently no sign that that will change. Despite his citizens starving, Kim has a lot of pride. Earlier in February this year, North Korea's regime newspaper derided foreign aid as poison candy and an insult to the country's honor and dignity. South Korea has also offered aid with the provision that the North must resume negotiating a possible end to its nuclear weapons program. This has been a hard no because Kim sees nuclear arms as the guarantor of his regime's continued existence. Remove nuclear weapons and you might end the monarchy of North Korea. This is why he continues to flex that muscle whenever the chance arises, just so that he can continue to have influence on the international stage. As someone rightfully said, for the Kim regime, guns will always beat butter. However, such ways of thinking are not doing anything for the nation. This year, it was reported by the Bank of Korea that North Korea's economy contracted for the third straight year in 2022. This could all be attributed to factors we have mentioned before, like DPRK's ongoing COVID-19 border restrictions, international sanctions, and the impact of severe weather. The economic decline of 0.2% edged past the 0.1% slump in 2021, but was nowhere near the 4.5% drop recorded in 2020 when North Korea suffered its worst economic downturn since 1997 due to its self-imposed pandemic restrictions. What this means is that North Korea is now on a path of regression for 3 straight years, at the same time when its population is starving and malnourished. When you factor in all this information, it's easy to see why North Korea is a sorry state. Its whole existence as a nation has been a tumultuous one, and the nation is clearly on its last legs. Or is it? You know, on Business Basics, the goal is always to provide all the information and let you deliberate on a concussion. There is a strong school of thought that perpetuates the fact that the fall of North Korea is a myth perpetuated by a Western agenda. What is the rebuttal to some of the points we shared above? Let us give them to you. In the article we showed, scholars Song-Ki Kim Eun-Ju Choi argued that there is almost no possibility that the North Korean economy will collapse. Despite the hostile economic conditions and rough times, North Korea has already developed internal conditions for survival with which it can manage to muddle through strong sanctions. Since the early 2010s, the government in Pyongyang has pursued an economic policy of reform and openness to strengthen its survival capacity and resilience. In 2018, its national strategy shifted from a military-first approach to an economy-first one. New economic changes in North Korea encompass a wide range of areas, such as facilitating import substitution and domestic production, adopting competitive systems, expanding markets, reforming financial institutions, establishing commercial banks, and promoting science and technology. However, the opening up policy has been postponed because of strong economic sanctions caused by North Korea's nuclear program. Something of particular to note is that the adoption of both the Socialist Corporate Responsible Management System and Field Responsibility System has increased production and facilitated distribution in light industry and agriculture. The former grants firms substantive management rights to run business autonomously, and the latter permits individual farmers to be rewarded for their crop yields. As a result of an import substitution policy, the proportion of domestically manufactured products has rapidly increased in markets. Also, exchange rates and market prices for items such as rice and gasoline have become relatively stable. Assuming that the prevailing conditions continue, and by that we mean the international sanctions regime, it will be difficult for North Korea to achieve economic prosperity through its self-reliant strategy. But it will have no problem in maintaining the status quo or achieving a low level of gradual economic development. The scholars also argue that denuclearization is still an option that North Korea could pursue, as it has always outlined its conditions for this. By doing so, it could just as easily integrate back into the international markets and grow economically. So, it is for these reasons that some believe that the idea of North Korea collapsing is a persistent fallacy, almost a mythology in US foreign policy thinking. We'll leave you to deliberate in the comments section and let us know what you think lies in wait in the future for North Korea. One thing that we have to mention in this video without fail might be this. North Korea's secret plan.
North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un has arrived in Russia's Far East this morning.
It was at the instigation of the Chinese, President Xi Jinping actually inviting Kim over.
Overseas now to a rare meeting today between two nuclear-armed adversaries of the U.S., North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin.
Kim Jong-un and his wife were welcomed like old friends by President Xi Jinping.
Kim Jong-un has been fostering even closer ties with both Russia and China, North Korea's traditional allies. By hosting delegations from these two nations, as he did this year at a summit, Kim is sending a message to the world. That message is simple. It is that North Korea, China, and Russia would stand shoulder to shoulder against the revived United States, South Korea, Japan trilateral coalition, and that his weapons program has the backing of Russia and China. Behind the scenes, what Kim is trying to do is to play off Russia and China to strengthen his country's position. At present, China is more important to North Korea than Russia. North Korea and China share a 1,350-kilometer border, and China bore much of the fighting during the Korean War, and is expected to come to North Korea's aid under the 1961 Alliance Treaty should the war resume. Still, North Korea wants an alternative option to lessen its dependence on China. Playing Russia off against China is a chance to get the best deals from both, just as North Korea did under Kim Il-sung in 1961. Exploiting Russia's isolation and desperation because it invaded Ukraine will give Kim further leverage, which possibly includes access to weapons technologies that China would not be comfortable transferring to North Korea. However, unlike his predecessors, Kim Jong-un would not have it easy. The reason Kim Il-sung succeeded in manipulating Russia and China back in his time was due to the then poor state of Sino-Soviet relations. Things are different now between Russia and China. The No Limits Partnership sees the two countries uniting instead of diverging, in opposition to the United States and its allies. Neither Beijing nor Moscow wants to compete for influence in North Korea, which is the most important condition for a successful North Korean exploitation of China-Russia differences. Unless you're the prize, the attention is not as severe, and your absence is less fondly missed. That summarizes the situation for North Korea. Besides all that, China can better exploit Russia's weakness than North Korea. In this triangular relationship, China is the greater power, economically, and with fast-growing military strength. Unlike during the split, neither Russia nor North Korea can or want to form an alliance directed against China. Kim will be able to procure advanced military technologies from Russia, but he will have to gauge China's possible reaction before any radical steps, such as deciding to test a nuclear device. The revived United States-South Korea-Japan trilateral alliance will consolidate the China-North Korea-Russian security bloc. However, that does not mean Kim will get to do whatever he wants. It's not quite 1961 all over again. It will be quite interesting to see how things go, and if needed, Kim could get a leg up in this. What is clear is this: North Korea is not in the best possible position right now. Its future is heavily dependent on what happens next, both internally on an economic level and internationally on a global scale. Only time will tell if what we are witnessing are the last days of North Korea, or if indeed a bounce back is on its way.